April 7, 1945. The explosion rose 6 kilometers into the sky above the East China Sea. The mushroom cloud could be seen from 100 miles away, and the thunderclap shattered windows on distant islands. This was not an atomic bomb. This was the death cry of the largest warship ever built, the battleship Yamato. But this story begins 5 years earlier, in 1940, in the secret shipyards of Kure Naval Arsenal. The workers called it Building Number 2, but they whispered about what lay beneath the massive canvas screens that blocked every view from land, sea, and sky. Japanese military police patrolled the perimeter with orders to shoot anyone who tried to photograph or even sketch what was taking shape inside. The secrecy was so absolute that workers were assigned to different sections of the hull, never seeing the complete picture. Only a select few knew they were witnessing the birth of a monster. Inside those screens, sparks flew from welding torches as thick as a man's arm. The sound was deafening, not the rhythmic hammering of traditional shipbuilding, but the industrial roar of a nation's ambition made manifest in steel. The keel alone weighed more than an entire destroyer. When workers needed to walk from bow to stern, it took them over 2 minutes at a brisk pace. This was not just a ship, it was a floating fortress the size of a city block. The man overseeing this mechanical miracle was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy. He stood on the construction platform, watching as the massive gun turrets were lowered into place by cranes that groaned under their weight. Each turret housed 3 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. A single shell from these monsters weighed as much as a small car and could punch through 3 feet of steel armor at a distance of 25 miles. "We are building more than a ship," Yamamoto told his aide, watching as hundreds of workers swarmed over the hull like ants constructing a steel cathedral. "We are building Japan's answer to American industrial might." The timing was everything. In Europe, Hitler's blitzkrieg had shattered Poland in weeks and France in 40 days, proving that speed and concentration of force could overcome numerical superiority. Japan's admirals believed the same principle could work at sea. Where America might build 10 ships, Japan would build 1 Mainz, but that one would be worth 20. The Yamato's specifications read like fantasy. At full load, she would displace 72,800 tons, nearly twice the weight of America's newest battleships. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, designed to stop any shell the Americans could fire. Her speed of 27 knots meant she could choose when and where to fight. Most importantly, her 9 massive guns could deliver devastating firepower at ranges where enemy ships couldn't even reach her. As 1941 dawned, the secrecy became even more intense. American intelligence was sniffing around, and Japanese naval officers knew that their window of strategic surprise was closing. The ship had to be completed and ready before the Americans realized what was coming. On December 16, 1941, exactly 9 days after Pearl Harbor had stunned the world, the Yamato officially entered service. The timing was not coincidental. As American battleships lay burning in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, Japan's ultimate weapon was ready to ensure those ships would never be replaced by anything that could threaten Japanese supremacy. The Pearl Harbor attack had been a masterpiece of tactical surprise, but it was also, in Admiral Yamamoto's words, a desperate gamble. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant," he confided to his staff. The Yamato was Japan's insurance policy, a ship so powerful that even America's vast industrial capacity could not build anything to match her. But there was a problem that few in the Japanese Navy wanted to acknowledge. The same Pearl Harbor attack that had crippled America's battleship fleet had also demonstrated something revolutionary. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, were the new queens of naval warfare. The age of the big gun was ending just as Japan had built the biggest gun of all. The irony was lost on most Japanese naval officers, intoxicated as they were by their early victories. Singapore had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were theirs. The Philippines were crumbling. Across the Pacific, the rising sun flag flew over conquered territories, and the Yamato represented the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power. Yet even as the great ship conducted her sea trials in early 1942, cracks were appearing in the foundation of Japanese strategy. The Doolittle raid in April 16 American bombers launched from an aircraft carrier to bomb Tokyo itself. showed that the war had changed. Distance no longer provided protection. The enemy could strike from the sky. In June came the Battle of Midway, where Admiral Yamamoto himself commanded the combined fleet from the Yamato's bridge. The great ship was there, in the center of the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. Her massive guns were loaded and ready. Her crew stood at battle stations, eager to prove their worth. But they never fired a shot. The battle was fought entirely by aircraft, Japanese and American planes clashing in the sky, while the mighty battleships wallowed uselessly below. In a single day, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and their irreplaceable experienced pilots. The Yamato, for all her massive firepower, could only watch helplessly as Japan's naval supremacy died in the skies above the Pacific. Standing on the Yamato's bridge as the defeated fleet retreated toward Japan, Admiral Yamamoto understood with crushing clarity what he had created. The ship was a masterpiece, the finest example of naval architecture and gunnery the world had ever seen. She was also an anachronism, a magnificent relic of a type of warfare that was already obsolete. The Hotel Yamato period had begun. Too valuable to risk in battle, too powerful to ignore, the great ship became a symbol of Japan's confused priorities, building for the last war while fighting the next one. She was the ultimate expression of technological excellence applied to strategic irrelevance. The months after Midway passed like a fever dream for the crew of the Yamato. They had trained for decisive battle, for the moment when their massive guns would speak with the voice of thunder and settle the fate of nations. Instead, they found themselves anchored at Truk Lagoon, swinging idly at anchor while smaller ships fought and died in the Solomons. The crew began calling her Hotel Yamato. The joke stung because it was true. While destroyers and cruisers engaged American forces in the grinding night battles around Guadalcanal, the Yamato remained safely in port, her precious fuel too valuable to waste, her irreplaceable bulk too risky to commit. She had become a symbol without substance, a sword too beautiful to draw from its scabbard. Lieutenant Commander Naoyoshi Ishida stood watch on the bridge, staring out at the lagoon's deceptively peaceful waters. 6 months ago, he had been proud to serve aboard the world's most powerful warship. Now he wondered if they were prisoners of their own magnificence. Around him, junior officers played cards and wrote letters home, trying to fill the endless hours of inactivity. The irony was inescapable. America's industrial giant was awakening exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had feared. Intelligence reports spoke of new shipyards working around the clock, of aircraft carriers being launched faster than Japan could sink them. Yet here sat the Yamato, the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power, doing nothing while the tide of war slowly turned against them. Captain Jihachi Takeyanagi tried to maintain morale through endless drills and training exercises. "We must be ready," he told his officers during their daily briefings. "Our moment will come." But privately, he shared Ishida's doubts. How could they be ready for a war that was changing faster than they could adapt? The war that reached them was not the one they had trained for. Instead of massive fleet actions with battleships firing at extreme range, they faced swarms of American aircraft that seemed to multiply like locusts. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns, hastily added after Midway, were pathetically inadequate against determined air attack. Her magnificent 18.1-inch guns, designed to destroy enemy battleships at 25 miles, were useless against dive bombers coming in at 300 miles per hour. In late 1942, the Yamato finally received orders to sail south toward Guadalcanal. The crew's excitement was palpable. At last, their moment had come. But as they approached the combat zone, new orders arrived. Turn back. American aircraft carriers were in the area, and the risk was deemed too great. Once again, the Hotel Yamato returned to port, her guns still silent. The pattern repeated itself throughout 1943. Alerts and preparations, hopes raised and dashed, promises of battle that never materialized. The ship that was supposed to embody Japanese fighting spirit became a symbol of paralysis and indecision. Her crew watched enviously as smaller ships earned battle honors while they accumulated only frustration. By early 1944, the strategic situation had become desperate. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, bypassing and isolating Japanese strongholds. The carefully constructed defensive perimeter was crumbling, not through direct assault, but through being made irrelevant. The Americans had learned to fight a different kind of war, one where mobility and air power trumped armor and heavy guns. The Yamato's sister ship Musashi had been completed in 1942, giving Japan two of these maritime monsters. Together, they represented an investment that could have built 4 aircraft carriers or 20 destroyers. But aircraft carriers required trained pilots, and Japan's best aviators were dead in the waters around Midway and the Solomons. The institutional knowledge that had made the Japanese Navy formidable was being bled away in 1,000 small actions, while the super-battleships waited for a decisive battle that would never come. Admiral Somo Toyota, who had succeeded the killed Yamato as commander of the combined fleet, faced an impossible dilemma. The Yamato and Musashi were too valuable to risk but too powerful to ignore. They consumed vast quantities of fuel oil, a resource becoming critically scarce, while contributing nothing to Japan's defensive efforts. Yet their symbolic value was enormous. To lose either ship would be a psychological blow Japan could not afford. The breaking point came in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Once again, the Yamato sailed toward battle as the flagship of the combined fleet. Once again, the decisive action was fought entirely by aircraft while the mighty battleships remained spectators to their own obsolescence. But this time, the consequences were catastrophic. Japan lost 3 more aircraft carriers and virtually all of its remaining experienced pilots in what American pilots mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Standing on the Yamato's bridge as the defeated fleet limped back to Japan, Admiral Toyota felt the weight of strategic reality settling on his shoulders like a burial shroud. The Americans weren't just winning, they were rewriting the rules of naval warfare. Their new Essex-class carriers could launch more aircraft than Japan had in its entire remaining fleet. Their pilots were fresh and well-trained, while Japan's were increasingly green recruits with barely enough flight time to take off and land safely. The ship around him suddenly felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a dead concept of naval warfare. Every rivet, every plate of armor, every perfectly machined gun represented thousands of hours of skilled labor and irreplaceable resources devoted to fighting the previous war. The Yamato was a masterpiece of 1918, thinking applied with 1940 technology to a 1944 conflict that had moved beyond both. October 1944 brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history and the Yamato's last chance to justify her existence. The Japanese plan was desperate but elegant: lure the American carriers away with a decoy force, then send the battleships, including both Yamato and Musashi, through the Philippines to destroy the vulnerable troop transports. For once, the plan seemed to be working. The American carriers took the bait and raced north, leaving the landing beaches protected only by escort carriers, small, slow ships, never intended for fleet combat. The Yamato's moment had finally arrived. But the Americans had learned to think in 3 dimensions. As the Japanese battleships steamed through the Philippine waters, wave after wave of American aircraft rose from small escort carriers that the Japanese had dismissed as insignificant. These were not the massive fleet carriers with their 100-plane air wings, but smaller vessels with just 30 aircraft each. Yet there were dozens of them, and their pilots were determined to stop the battleships at any cost. The Musashi died first, pounded by torpedo and bomb, until she rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, taking most of her crew with her. The sight shook the Yamato's crew to their core. If the mighty Musashi could be destroyed by aircraft, what did that say about their own chances? The Yamato herself came under heavy attack during the battle. Her anti-aircraft guns fired desperately at the swarms of American dive bombers and torpedo planes, but there were simply too many targets. Bombs crashed into her superstructure, and torpedoes slammed into her armored hull. Yet she survived, her massive construction absorbing punishment that would have sunk any other ship. But survival was not victory. As the battle raged around her, the Yamato's main guns finally spoke in anger, hurling massive shells at the American escort carriers. At last, the weapons that had been 5 years in the making were being used for their intended purpose, but the targets were moving too fast and too erratically for the great guns' ponderous aiming systems. Shell after shell missed, sending towering waterspouts into the air around the fleeing American ships. The irony was complete. The world's most powerful naval guns, designed to fight other battleships in a predictable linear engagement, were helpless against small, fast-moving targets that refused to stand and fight. The Yamato had been built to fight the Battle of Jutland, but the Americans were fighting the Battle of Britain at sea. As dawn broke over Leyte Gulf, the remnants of the Japanese fleet retreated. The Yamato had finally seen action, but the experience had been more humiliating than glorious. Her massive guns had failed to sink a single major American vessel, while aircraft, those flimsy constructions of aluminum and fabric, had destroyed her sister ship and crippled the dream of Japanese naval supremacy. The crew's morale plummeted during the long voyage back to Japan. They had been told they were invincible, that their ship represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. Instead, they had learned that they were obsolete, that the war had moved beyond them while they waited in port for battles that would never come. Fuel oil was now so scarce that the Yamato could barely move. The once proud combined fleet had been reduced to a handful of ships hiding in the inland sea, emerging only when absolutely necessary. American B-29 bombers flew overhead with impunity, reducing Japanese cities to ash while the great warships cowered in port. The final humiliation came in early 1945. With the American invasion of Okinawa imminent, the Japanese High Command made a decision that spoke to their desperation. The Yamato would be sent on a one-way mission to the battle zone. She would beach herself on the Okinawan coast and use her massive guns as shore batteries until she was destroyed. It was not a military operation, it was a suicide mission disguised as strategy. As winter gave way to spring, the Yamato swung at anchor in the inland sea, waiting for orders that everyone knew would be her last. Her crew prepared for death with the stoic resignation of samurai, but beneath the surface, a terrible question haunted them. What had it all been for? The ship that was supposed to secure Japan's naval supremacy had instead become a symbol of strategic failure. The technology that was meant to overwhelm America's numerical advantage had proven irrelevant against America's tactical innovation. The Yamato had been built to fight yesterday's war, and tomorrow's war was already being fought by other means. Standing on the bridge as another day ended without orders, Lieutenant Commander Ishida reflected on the cruel joke history had played on them. They had built the ultimate battleship just as battleships became obsolete. They had created the perfect answer to a question no one was asking anymore. The age of the gun was ending, and the age of the aircraft had begun. The Yamato, for all her magnificent power, was already a relic of a bygone era. Her death, when it came, would mark not just the end of a ship, but the end of an entire philosophy of naval warfare. The only question now was whether that death would have any meaning, or whether it would be as futile as the years of waiting that had preceded it. April 5, 1945. The orders arrived at dawn, sealed and marked with the highest classification. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito read them in the privacy of his cabin aboard the Yamato, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the paper in his hands. Operation Tengo. The final sortie. The plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The Yamato, accompanied by one light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would steam toward Okinawa, where American forces had been landing for 5 days. She would fight her way through the American fleet, beach herself on the island's shore, and use her massive guns as artillery until she was destroyed. There was fuel for a one-way trip only. No provision for return had been made because none was expected. Captain Aruga assembled the crew on deck that evening. 3,332 men stood in silent ranks as he read the orders aloud. "We sail tomorrow on a special attack mission," he announced, his voice carrying across the still water of the inland sea. "Our destination is Okinawa. Our purpose is to die with honor for the Emperor and the homeland." The reaction was not what he had expected. Instead of the traditional shouts of banzai, there was only silence. These men had spent 4 years watching the war slip away from Japan. They had seen sister ships sunk by aircraft while their own mighty guns remained silent. They understood, perhaps better than their commanders, that this was not a military operation but an elaborate form of ritual suicide. Lieutenant Commander Ishida stood among his men, feeling the weight of their unspoken questions. What would their deaths accomplish that 4 years of war had not? Would their sacrifice change anything, or would it simply add another tragic footnote to Japan's inevitable defeat? But there was also something else in that silence, a kind of relief. The waiting was over. The uncertainty was ended. They had been built for battle, trained for war, and now they would finally fulfill their purpose, even if that fulfillment meant destruction. As the crew prepared the ship for her final voyage, a strange transformation occurred. The paralysis that had gripped the Yamato for so long began to lift. Her engines, silent for months, roared to life. Her massive guns were loaded with the high explosive shells intended for shore bombardment. Her anti-aircraft batteries were checked and rechecked, though everyone knew they would be inadequate against what was coming. The night before departure, many of the crew wrote final letters home. They spoke not of glorious victory, but of duty, honor, and the hope that their sacrifice would somehow matter. Some wrote poems in the classical style, comparing themselves to cherry blossoms falling in spring. Others simply said goodbye. April 6, 1945. At 15:20 hours, the Yamato weighed anchor for the last time. As she steamed through the narrow channels between the Japanese home islands, crowds gathered on the shores to watch her pass. Many of them wept, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing the end of an era. The small fleet made good time through the first night, but by dawn on April 7th, they had been spotted. American submarines shadowed them from a distance, radioing position reports back to the massive carrier task forces that were already launching aircraft. The trap was closing with mechanical precision. At 8:23 hours, the first American reconnaissance planes appeared on the horizon. They circled just outside anti-aircraft range, counting ships and assessing the threat. Within hours, the reports had reached Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58. His response was swift and overwhelming: launch everything. By 10 o'clock hours, nearly 400 American aircraft were airborne and heading toward the Yamato's position. They came in waves, first the fighters to suppress anti-aircraft fire, then the dive bombers and torpedo planes to deliver the killing blows. It was the largest airstrike ever launched against a single ship. From the Yamato's bridge, Admiral Ito watched the approaching formations with a mixture of dread and admiration. The sky seemed filled with aircraft, their wings glinting in the morning sun like a cloud of metallic insects. He had always known this moment would come, but the reality was more overwhelming than any simulation or war game had prepared him for. At 12:32 hours, the attack began. The first wave of American fighters swept over the Japanese formation, their machine guns chattering as they strafed the ship's anti-aircraft positions. The Yamato's dozens of 25 guns fired desperately back, filling the air with tracer rounds that seemed pitifully inadequate against the swarms of attacking aircraft. Then came the dive bombers screaming down from 10,000 feet with their 1,000-pound bombs. The first hits shook the massive ship like an earthquake, but her armor held. These were the moments she had been designed for Nias to absorb punishment that would destroy any other vessel and keep fighting. But the Americans had learned from 4 years of war against Japanese naval architecture. Instead of trying to penetrate the Yamato's massive deck armor, they concentrated their torpedo attacks on her sides, below the waterline, where even her thick belt armor had limits. Wave after wave of Avenger torpedo bombers came in low and fast, releasing their weapons at point-blank range before pulling away through the curtain of anti-aircraft fire. The first torpedo struck at 12:45 hours on the port side, then another and another. Water began flooding into the Yamato's compartments, despite her intricate damage control systems. The great ship began to list to port, slowly at first, then more noticeably. Captain Aruga ordered counter-flooding on the starboard side to correct the list, but this meant deliberately flooding compartments and drowning the men trapped inside them. The choice was stark: sacrifice hundreds of crew members to keep the ship fighting, or let the entire vessel capsize. He gave the order, and hundreds of his men died to keep their ship afloat a few minutes longer. But the attacks continued relentlessly. More torpedoes, more bombs. The Yamato's superstructure was a mass of twisted metal and flames. Her anti-aircraft guns were being systematically destroyed, leaving her increasingly defenseless against each successive wave. Still she fought on, her massive main guns firing at maximum elevation in a desperate attempt to bring down some of the attacking aircraft. The shells burst harmlessly in the sky, their fragments adding to the deadly rain falling on her own decks. By 14 o'clock hours, the situation was hopeless. The ship had taken at least 8 torpedo hits and countless bombs. She was listing 20 degrees to port and losing way. Her compartments were flooding faster than damage control teams could contain the water. Admiral Ito gave the order that everyone had been expecting: abandon ship. But many of the crew had already made a different choice. Rather than face the shame of surrender, they chose to go down with their ship. Some tied themselves to their guns so they could keep firing until the end. Others simply stood at their posts, waiting for the water to claim them. At 14:20 hours, the Yamato rolled over on her port side. As she capsized, her magazines exploded in a chain reaction that could be felt 50 miles away. The blast was so enormous that American pilots flying overhead were thrown around their cockpits by the shock wave. The mushroom cloud rose 6 kilometers into the sky, visible from the horizon in every direction. In that moment, more than just a ship died. The explosion marked the end of the battleship era, the final obsolescence of the big gun in naval warfare. It was the funeral pyre of a military philosophy that had dominated the world's oceans for half a century. Of the 3,332 men aboard, only 280 survived. They were picked up by the escorting destroyers, themselves damaged and barely afloat. Among the dead was Admiral Ito, who had chosen to go down with his ship rather than survive Japan's defeat. The news of the Yamato's destruction reached Tokyo that evening. Emperor Hirohito, learning of the loss, reportedly said nothing for several minutes. When he finally spoke, it was to observe that Japan had lost not just a ship, but the symbol of her naval power. The way to the home islands was now clear. In the years that followed, historians would debate whether Operation Tengo had accomplished anything beyond the deaths of brave men. Some argued that it had delayed the American advance by forcing them to divert resources. Others maintained that it was simply a magnificent gesture of defiance, a refusal to surrender without honor. But perhaps the truth was simpler and more profound. The Yamato had been built to embody Japan's vision of naval supremacy, the idea that technological excellence and warrior spirit could overcome any disadvantage. Her destruction proved that vision wrong, but it also demonstrated something else, that there are moments when honor matters more than victory, when the manner of defeat defines a nation more than the fact of it. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. And somewhere in the depths of the East China Sea, the Yamato rested as a monument to the warriors who chose duty over survival and honor over pragmatism. She had finally fulfilled her purpose, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of an ending, and perhaps, in her own strange way, a beginning.